Imagine running a marathon,
Yeah.
feeling that runner's high, and then bam, suddenly you can barely climb a flight of stairs.
Wow.
That's the reality for one of the many people whose story we're going to explore today as we take a deep dive into long COVID.
It's a condition that's impacting millions all around the world, and it's really forcing us to rethink, what it means to recover from a virus.
We've got a stack of research articles here and personal stories.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious to kind of dig into what this all means for, the future.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at the science, the impact on society, even some potential long-term consequences.
Right.
So this is definitely one of those topics you'll want to pay attention to.
Absolutely. We're really only beginning to understand the full scope of long COVID, but what we are learning is fascinating, but also kind of concerning.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is long COVID?
Right.
We hear the term thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean for people who are experiencing it?
Yeah, so long COVID, or PASSE, which stands for post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, is essentially this constellation of symptoms that persist for weeks, months, or even years after the initial COVID-19 infection.
Wow.
It's not just a lingering cough or a little bit of fatigue. We're talking about a really wide range of effects that can be quite debilitating.
And it's more common than you might think, right?
Oh, yeah.
Studies estimate that 10 to 30% of people who have had COVID-19 experience these lingering symptoms.
That's a huge number of people. I mean, think about it. Your own circle of friends, family, statistically speaking, chances are someone you know is dealing with this right now.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've got a lot of people experiencing this, but what does long COVID actually feel like?
Right.
What are some of the common symptoms that people are reporting?
Well, one of the most frequent issues is difficulty breathing. Imagine struggling to catch your breath after just a short walk.
Oh, wow.
That's the daily reality for many with long COVID.
That must be terrifying.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about the lungs, are we?
No, not at all. Long COVID can impact multiple systems in the body. We see cardiovascular problems like chest pain, heart palpitations, and even myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart muscle.
And this is happening even in people who had relatively mild initial COVID infections.
That's right. One study actually found that 78 out of 100 recovered COVID-19 patients had abnormal findings on a cardiovascular MRI, even though many of them hadn't been seriously ill with the virus initially.
It's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the potential for hidden damage that we might not even be aware of.
Yeah.
And then there are the neurological and cognitive impacts, which seem to be particularly perplexing.
Absolutely. Brain fog, memory problems, these persistent headaches, and even the loss of smell or taste.
Yeah.
All of these things are pointing to the possibility that COVID-19 can actually affect the brain.
In one of the articles we have here, someone with long COVID describes the sensation in their arms and legs as permanently fizzing, as if injected with Szechuan peppercorns.
Wow, that's such a vivid and honestly strange description. It really highlights how unusual and hard to explain some of these symptoms can be.
Yeah, definitely not your typical post-viral fatigue. Makes you wonder what's actually happening at a neurological level.
Scientists are still trying to figure that out. They're looking into things like inflammation, damage to blood vessels in the brain, and even the possibility of, persistent viral particles lingering in the nervous system.
It's all pretty complex, but we're getting a clearer picture every day. And it's not just the physical symptoms that are concerning. There's a huge mental and emotional toll, too.
Oh, absolutely. The combination of these persistent physical symptoms, and then you add in the social isolation many people experienced during the pandemic.
Right.
And it creates this perfect storm for mental health challenges.
Yeah.
Anxiety and depression are incredibly common among those with long COVID.
You can imagine how isolating it would be. You're dealing with these strange and often debilitating symptoms, and a lot of people just don't understand what you're going through.
Right. And for those who were hospitalized or had a severe case of COVID-19, there's even the possibility of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD.
Wow, that adds another layer of complexity to an already really challenging situation.
Yeah.
It really highlights the need for mental health support as part of the long COVID recovery process.
Yeah, and we can't forget about the impact of sleep disturbances, which are also very common with long COVID. Insomnia and other sleep issues can further exacerbate both the physical and the mental symptoms.
It's like this vicious cycle, The physical symptoms impact mental health, sleep suffers, and everything just kind of spirals downward. It's hard to imagine how tough it must be to cope with all of this.
It is incredibly challenging, and it's a reminder that, we really need to be providing comprehensive support for people with long COVID. We need to address the physical symptoms, of course, but we also need to provide resources for mental health and help people find ways to manage their sleep issues.
So we've talked about, how widespread long COVID is some of the symptoms.
Right.
But how is this impacting the world beyond these individual experiences?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is the impact on the workforce. Increased absenteeism and the difficulty many people face in returning to work are really putting a strain on industries across the board.
It's easy to see how that would happen. If you're constantly fatigued, struggling to focus, and dealing with, chronic pain, holding down a job becomes incredibly difficult.
Exactly. And then there's the financial burden both on individuals and families and on the healthcare system as a whole.
Right.
The need for long-term medical care rehabilitation services, mental health support, all of that is putting a significant strain on resources.
And we're only just beginning to grasp the full extent of the economic impact. Some experts are even comparing the potential long-term consequences of long COVID to those of the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
It's a sobering thought, and it really underscores the urgency of addressing this issue. We need to find ways to support people with long COVID, to help them manage their symptoms, and to get them back to a place where they can live full and productive lives.
It sounds like we're facing a pretty complex challenge here.
Yeah.
But there's hope, right?
Hmm.
I mean, research is ongoing. We're learning more every day.
Absolutely. The scientific community is making remarkable progress in understanding the mechanisms behind long COVID, and that's paving the way for the development of better treatments.
One of the articles we have here mentions a potential link between COVID-19, the NLRP3 inflammasome,
Okay.
and the possible development or worsening of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
That's right.
It almost seems like we're uncovering more and more potential long-term consequences.
It's definitely a concern. Think of the NLRP3 inflammasome like a fire alarm in your body.
Right.
In a healthy system, it goes off when there's a real threat, like an infection or an injury, and it triggers inflammation to fight it off. But in some cases, it seems like COVID-19 might be causing this alarm system to malfunction, setting off constant inflammation, even when there's no immediate danger.
So it's like a fire alarm that's stuck on constantly blaring even though there's no fire.
Exactly. And that constant inflammation could be contributing to the long-term damage we're seeing in various organs, including the brain. It's a very interesting avenue of research, but it also raises some unsettling questions about the potential long-term consequences of COVID-19.
It seems like vaccination plays a role in all of this as well. Is that right?
Yes, studies suggest that being vaccinated against COVID-19 may actually reduce the likelihood of developing long COVID.
So getting vaccinated isn't just about protecting yourself from getting really sick in the short term. It could also be about reducing your risk of these long-term consequences.
Exactly. It adds another layer of importance to vaccination efforts. And it's one more reason why we need to be doing everything we can to promote vaccination and make it accessible to everyone.
It's clear that this deep dive is really shedding light on the complexity of long COVID.
For sure.
We've covered so much ground, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
It's a multifaceted issue, and it seems like we're only just beginning to understand its full impact.
There's still so much to learn, but the more we understand about long COVID, the better equipped we'll be to develop effective treatments, preventive strategies, and ultimately create a better future for those living with this condition.
We've still got lots to discuss, but first, how about we dive into some of the treatments and management options that are available for those who are struggling with long COVID?
That sounds good. There are several approaches, and while there isn't a one-size-fits-all cure, yet there are definitely things that can be done to help manage symptoms and improve quality of life.
That's got to be a relief for those who are struggling with this. What are some of the most promising approaches right now?
Well, one key area is symptom management. Physical therapy can be incredibly helpful in addressing mobility issues and pain, while respiratory therapy can help with breathing difficulties.
So it's about tailoring the treatment to the specific needs of each individual.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Okay.
And medications can be used to target specific symptoms as well, like headaches, fatigue, or sleep disturbances.
It sounds like a lot of trial and error, which can be frustrating for patients who are looking for quick solutions.
It can be a long road, but it's important to remember that even small improvements can make a big difference in someone's quality of life.
Absolutely. And what about rehabilitation programs?
Yeah.
Are those proving to be helpful for people with long COVID?
Absolutely. Rehabilitation programs are becoming increasingly important in helping people regain lost function and rebuild their lives step by step. These programs often take a multidisciplinary approach, incorporating physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and even cognitive rehabilitation.
It's like a holistic approach to recovery, addressing not just the physical symptoms, but the cognitive and emotional aspects as well.
Exactly. And of course, mental health support is crucial. Counseling therapy and even medication can be incredibly valuable in addressing the psychological impact of long COVID.
It's about acknowledging that the mental and emotional burden is just as real as the physical one.
Mm.
And there's no shame in seeking help.
Right.
It's a sign of strength, not weakness.
Absolutely. We need to create a culture where people feel comfortable talking about their mental health and seeking the support they need.
Speaking of seeking support, what kind of resources are available for people who are dealing with long COVID? Where can they turn for information and help?
Well, there are a growing number of resources available. There are online support groups, patient advocacy organizations, and even dedicated long COVID clinics popping up in some areas.
That's encouraging. It's great to see that this issue is finally getting the attention it deserves.
And the more awareness we raise, the more resources will become available. We need to keep talking about long COVID, keep sharing stories, and keep pushing for research and support.
I'm curious to hear more about the research side of things. What are scientists focusing on right now? Are there any promising avenues of research that give us hope for better treatments in the future?
There's a lot of exciting research happening right now. Scientists are digging deeper into the underlying causes of long COVID, exploring everything from immune responses to persistent viral particles to the role of inflammation and autoimmunity.
One of the articles mentions a new clinical trial that's testing a promising antiviral drug for long COVID patients.
Right.
Are there any other potential treatments on the horizon?
That's right. And there are a number of other promising therapies being explored as well, including immune modulating drugs, stem cell treatments, and even personalized rehabilitation programs tailored to the specific needs of each patient.
It sounds like the focus is shifting from simply managing symptoms to actually trying to address the underlying causes of long COVID.
Yeah,
Which is incredibly hopeful.
exactly. And as we continue to learn more about this complex condition, I'm confident that we'll see even more innovative treatments emerge in the years to come.
Welcome back to our deep dive into long COVID. Before the break, we were talking about the very real and often debilitating symptoms.
Right.
But what about the broader impact? This isn't just a personal health issue.
Right.
It's affecting our workplaces, healthcare systems,
Yeah.
and even raising some big economic questions.
It's true. The ripple effects of long COVID are far-reaching, and I think we're only just beginning to understand the full extent of its impact on society as a whole.
So let's zoom out a bit. What are some of the key socioeconomic concerns that are emerging as a result of long COVID?
Well, one of the most pressing issues is the impact on the workforce.
Yeah.
As we touched on before the break, many people with long COVID are finding it extremely difficult to return to their jobs or even to work at all.
It's not hard to see why. If you're dealing with chronic fatigue, brain fog pain,
Yeah.
just getting through a normal workday would be a huge challenge.
Exactly. And this is leading to increased absenteeism and a potential shortage of skilled labor in certain sectors. Some economists are even drawing parallels to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in terms of the potential long-term impact on the global workforce.
Wow, that's a pretty stark comparison.
Yeah.
It really puts the scale of this issue into perspective. And it's not just about the impact on businesses, right? There's a huge personal financial burden as well.
Absolutely. Many people with long COVID are facing a loss of income, which can obviously have devastating consequences for individuals and families, especially those who are already struggling financially.
Right.
And some are forced to rely on disability benefits, which often aren't enough to cover their basic needs.
It's heartbreaking to think about the financial stress that so many people are facing on top of, dealing with the physical and emotional challenges of long COVID.
It creates this vicious cycle. The financial strain adds to the stress and anxiety, which can actually worsen the long COVID symptoms. It's a really difficult situation for a lot of people.
Yeah, it sounds like it's clear that we need better support systems in place to help people navigate these challenges. What kind of solutions are being proposed to address the socioeconomic impacts of long COVID?
Well, on a policy level, there's a growing push for stronger social safety nets and more flexible work arrangements to accommodate those with long COVID.
That makes a lot of sense. We need to create a system that's more understanding and supportive of people with chronic illnesses.
Exactly. And we need to be thinking about retraining programs and job opportunities that are more accessible to people with long COVID. Some of the skills and talents people had before getting sick might not be feasible anymore, so we need to help them find new pathways to employment.
It's about adapting to this new reality and finding creative solutions. And what about the healthcare system? It seems like long COVID is putting a huge strain on resources there as well.
It is a significant burden, for sure. The need for long-term medical care, specialized rehabilitation services, and mental health support is stretching our healthcare systems thin, particularly in areas that were already struggling with limited resources.
One of the sources we have here talks about the need to create more integrated care pathways for people with long COVID.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It means improving communication and coordination between different healthcare providers. We need to make sure that primary care physicians, specialists, rehabilitation therapists, and mental health professionals are all working together to provide comprehensive and personalized care for long COVID patients.
So it's about creating a seamless system of care that addresses the complex and multifaceted needs of people with long COVID.
Exactly. We need to move away from the fragmented approach we often see in healthcare and create a more holistic system that recognizes the interconnectedness of physical, mental, and social well-being.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Long COVID isn't just a medical condition.
Right.
It's a social issue, an economic issue,
Mm-hmm.
and it's something that requires a multifaceted approach.
I completely agree. And it's important to remember that we're still in the early stages of understanding long COVID. As we learn more about the condition, we'll need to continually adapt our approaches to treatment, care, and support.
This deep dive is definitely revealing how much there is to learn.
Yeah.
I'm curious, while we're talking about the complexities of long COVID, have there been any comparisons drawn between this and other post-viral syndromes,
No.
like chronic fatigue syndrome?
That's a great question, and it's something that researchers and clinicians are starting to pay more attention to. There are definitely some striking similarities between long COVID and ME/CFS, which stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis chronic fatigue syndrome,
Okay.
both in terms of symptoms and the challenges people face in getting their condition recognized and treated.
It's interesting because for years, people with ME/CFS have struggled to get their condition taken seriously. They've faced dismissal from doctors, inadequate treatment options, and even stigma and disbelief from friends and family.
It's been a long and difficult road for the ME/CFS community.
Yeah.
There's still so much we don't understand about these post-viral syndromes, but hopefully the increased attention on long COVID will lead to more research and a better understanding of ME/CFS as well.
It's almost like long COVID is shining a spotlight on a group of conditions that have been overlooked and under-researched for far too long.
I think that's a fair assessment. And hopefully this will translate into more funding for research, better diagnostic tools, and more effective treatments for both long COVID and ME/CFS.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together, and that the health of one affects the well-being of all. And speaking of being in this together, I'm curious to hear more about the personal stories of people living with long COVID. What are their experiences like? What are their hopes and fears for the future?
Well, one of the articles we have here shares the story of a young woman who was a marathon runner before getting COVID-19, and she's now struggling to walk up a flight of stairs without feeling completely exhausted.
Wow.
It's a really powerful example of how this condition can rob people of their vitality, their passions, their ability to do the things they love.
It's heartbreaking to hear about the impact long COVID is having on people's lives.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize the importance of finding effective treatments and support systems.
Another story that really stuck with me was about a musician who lost their sense of smell and taste as a result of long COVID. And for them, it wasn't just about the inconvenience. It was about losing a fundamental part of their creative identity. They could no longer experience music and food the way they used to, and it had a profound impact on their mental health and well-being.
That's such a poignant reminder that long COVID affects people in so many different ways. It's not just about the physical symptoms, it's about the ripple effects on every aspect of a person's life.
These personal stories are so important because they remind us that behind every statistic, behind every research finding, there are real people facing real challenges.
We need to be listening to their stories, learning from their experiences, and doing everything we can to support them on their journey to recovery.
I completely agree. Their voices need to be heard, their stories need to be shared, and their experiences need to inform our understanding of long COVID and how we approach treatment and care.
So we've heard about the individual experiences, but what about the bigger picture? How is long COVID changing our understanding of health and illness?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's one of the most important aspects of this whole discussion. Long COVID is challenging our traditional binary of sick versus healthy. It exists in this gray area where people may not be acutely ill, but are far from fully recovered.
That's almost like it's forcing us to redefine what it means to be well.
Exactly, and it's highlighting the limitations of our current healthcare systems, which often focus on acute care rather than the long-term management of chronic conditions.
It seems like long COVID is forcing us to rethink our entire approach to healthcare.
I think that's a fair assessment. One of the sources we have here actually argues that long COVID could be a catalyst for change, a wake-up call that forces us to reimagine how we approach healthcare in the 21st century.
So what would that look like? What kind of changes are being proposed?
Well, there's a growing movement towards a more holistic model of care, one that takes into account the physical, mental, social, and even economic aspects of health.
So it's about moving away from a purely biomedical model that focuses solely on treating disease and embracing a more comprehensive approach that recognizes the interconnectedness of all aspects of well-being.
Exactly. And that means addressing the root causes of illness, not just treating the symptoms. It also means providing more support for preventive measures like healthy lifestyle choices, stress management, and access to quality health care.
It sounds like a pretty radical shift from the way we currently think about healthcare.
It is a significant shift, but I think it's one that's long overdue. And long COVID might just be the catalyst that forces us to make those changes.
It's interesting to think about how this pandemic could lead to such fundamental changes in our approach to healthcare.
Crises often create opportunities for innovation and transformation, and long COVID is certainly forcing us to confront some of the shortcomings of our current healthcare systems and to think differently about how we approach health and well-being.
It's definitely a lot to process. Before we move on, is there anything else you want to highlight about the socioeconomic impact of long COVID?
Yes, I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't just an individual problem, it's a societal problem. The economic costs of long COVID are already significant, and they're only going to increase in the years to come.
So what can we do about it? How can we mitigate those costs and ensure that people with long COVID have the support they need?
Well, one important step is investing more in research. The more we understand about long COVID, the better equipped we'll be to develop effective treatments and preventative strategies.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about on a policy level? What kind of changes could be implemented to help people with long COVID?
Well, we need policies that protect workers with long COVID, ensure access to affordable health care, and provide financial assistance to those who are unable to work.
It's about creating a safety net for those who are struggling with this condition and recognizing that this is a public health crisis that requires a coordinated response.
Exactly. We need a comprehensive approach that addresses both the individual and societal impacts of long COVID.
Well, we've discussed the symptoms, the science, and the wider impact of long COVID. Now it's time to shift gears a bit and dive into some of the more philosophical questions surrounding this condition. When we return, we'll explore the ethical considerations and the ways in which long COVID is forcing us to reevaluate our relationship with health and illness. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've spent a lot of time, discussing the science, the symptoms, and the societal impact of long COVID. But now I think it's time to kind of step back and consider the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Long COVID isn't just changing lives. It's challenging our very understanding of what it means to be healthy.
It's true. We often think about health and illness as these two distinct categories.
Right.
But long COVID really kind of blurs those lines. It forces us to grapple with this idea that someone can be not sick in the traditional sense,
Right.
but also far from well.
It's like disrupting our existing paradigms. We're so used to thinking of illness as something with a clear beginning, a defined course, and a definitive end. But long COVID doesn't fit neatly into that box at all.
You're right, it doesn't. And this has profound implications for how we define disability, how we assess functional limitations, and how we provide support for those struggling with chronic and often invisible illnesses.
It also seems to expose some of the limitations of our current healthcare systems, which, as you mentioned before, are often geared towards acute care rather than the long-term management of chronic conditions.
Exactly. And long COVID is really shining a light on the need for a more patient-centered approach to healthcare, one that recognizes the complexity of these chronic conditions and the importance of addressing the whole person, not just their symptoms.
I'm also wondering about the impact on healthcare workers.
Yeah.
They're on the front lines dealing with this influx of patients with a condition that we're still trying to understand. It must be incredibly challenging.
It is. Healthcare workers are facing a steep learning curve, and many are feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of long COVID patients seeking help. There's a real need for more training and resources to equip healthcare providers with the knowledge and tools they need to effectively care for this growing population.
It's a reminder of the interconnectedness of all of this. Long COVID isn't just impacting individuals.
Right.
It's affecting everyone in the healthcare system and beyond.
It's also raising some really important ethical considerations that we need to be talking about.
Like what?
Well, for example, how do we prioritize care for long COVID patients when resources are already stretched so thin?
Right.
How do we ensure equitable access to treatment and support?
Yeah.
These are really complex questions with no easy answer.
And there's the issue of potential bias in diagnosis and treatment,
Right.
especially since many of the symptoms of long COVID are subjective and difficult to measure.
That's right. There's a risk that some people with long COVID might not be taken seriously, or that their symptoms might be dismissed as psychological rather than physical, especially if they don't fit the typical profile. We need to be very mindful of these potential biases and ensure that everyone with long COVID receives the care and support they deserve.
This has definitely been one of our most thought-provoking deep dives yet.
Yeah.
I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a really complex issue. But what are some of the key takeaways you want listeners to kind of walk away with?
Well, first and foremost, I want people to understand that long COVID is real, it's serious, and it's affecting millions of people around the world. We need to take this condition seriously, and we need to be advocating for more research, better treatments, and more support for those affected.
Absolutely. Awareness is key. The more we talk about long COVID, the more we can destigmatize it and ensure that people feel comfortable seeking help.
I also want listeners to understand that long COVID is a complex and evolving condition. There's still a lot we don't know, but researchers are working hard to uncover the underlying mechanisms and develop effective treatments.
So there's hope on the horizon.
Yeah.
And what about for individuals who are currently struggling with long COVID? What advice would you give them?
I would say, first and foremost, don't give up hope. There are resources available, and there are people who understand what you're going through. Reach out to support groups, connect with other long COVID patients, and find healthcare providers who are knowledgeable about this condition and who will listen to your concerns.
And be your own advocate, If you're not getting the answers or the support you need, keep pushing.
Exactly. You know your body best, and you deserve to have your voice heard.
This has been an incredibly insightful journey into the world of long COVID. I'm left with this mix of, concern and hope. Concern about the challenges we face, but also hope that we can rise to the occasion, learn from this experience, and ultimately create a better future for everyone.
I share that sentiment. This is a really pivotal moment, and it's up to all of us to work together to address the challenges of long COVID and create a more just and equitable world for those living with this condition. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue learning about long COVID, engaging in these conversations, and advocating for change. The journey to understanding and addressing this complex condition is just beginning, and we're all in this together.